bigger gain for Patrick Mahomes or loss for Lamar Jackson?
Bigger gain for Patrick Mahomes. I know the Ravens were going to have a problem re-signing him or couldn't afford it, whatever. How do you trade him to the Chiefs? Almost anyone other than Kansas City. Good luck. Let me tell you why Kansas City didn't win the Super Bowl this year. They didn't win the Super Bowl because they didn't have an offensive line at all. So Patrick Mahomes, who I thought was the most spectacular player in the Super Bowl, when I think of plays from that Super Bowl, I'm always going to remember what Mahomes did. He was pressured on over 50% of his snaps, and they almost never blitzed, so everyone was also covered because he had his 2 tackles missing. Both are some of their best players, right? Fisher and Schwartz, and they had to rebuild the whole thing. So you send them, if you're the Ravens, one of the best left tackles in the business in his prime. And by the way, they'd already signed Tooney, one of the best guards in the business, in his prime. And then they have guys who aren't in their primes anymore, but are still good offensive linemen. Tim, I can't believe what's going on. I just brought it up. I'm a Giants fan. They have been awful on the offensive line for 10 years. And every year they say they're going to rebuild it. And they never figure it out. And Kansas City looks like they just did it in 1 year. 1 year, by the middle of the season, at least on paper, it looks like this might be the best offensive line in the game, or among them. 1 year, and on the left side, on the quarterback's blind side, a tackle and guard. Oh my God, you can't do better than that. I'm just saying, get the best deal. They got good draft compensation. I get it. But if you're the Ravens, not to Kansas City, for the love of God. What are you doing? Mahomes is now going to be protected, health willing. Good luck stopping him.
Well, I think when you look at the Ravens, I'm looking at it from this perspective. They've got a multitude of needs, particularly needing a pass rusher, a wide receiver, and some other additional weapons. They've got the #1 rushing attack in football with the most electrifying runner from the quarterback position maybe the game has ever seen in Lamar Jackson, who religiously rushes for over 1,000 yards per season. At least he's done so for the last 2 years. So we've got to pay attention to that. And the fact that he's so elusive, and it obviously buffers their running game significantly. I think that goes a long way, Max Kellerman. And then again, you got to remember, even though they had the worst passing attack in football, you could point to his accuracy or lack thereof, but it's certainly not because of pressure. He was only sacked 29 times last year. He played 15 games. He was sacked less than 2 times per game. We've got to pay attention to that, along with the effectiveness with running. They may have felt they could afford to compromise their offensive line just a touch to get additional weapons. You got a first, you got a third, you got a 4th round pick in this year's draft, a later round pick in the 2022 NFL draft. You got to pay attention to all of those things along with their multitude of needs. And if there's one place they felt they could sacrifice, it's with that. That's why they did it. And that's why I think that I'm not going to knock them for it, because they know what they have in Lamar Jackson. They know his strengths. They obviously know his weaknesses, and they know the weaknesses that exist in other parts of their roster. And so if you can get multiple picks to address that, and you have to sacrifice it from the standpoint of your offensive line when you don't think that's going to sacrifice your running game, particularly with Lamar Jackson running the football out of the quarterback position, then that's a chance that you're willing to take. I can't sneeze at that.
Yeah, I think the Ravens, I don't think it really affects them all that much. Look, he was an unhappy player, and truth be told, with the way that the tackle position works with their quarterback run game, it really makes the tackles' jobs much easier because it gives them great angles in the run game. I think this is huge for Kansas City, and really what it makes me think about is the plan that the leadership in Kansas City have. We all know Andy Reid's a great coach, but I think about, them letting Dee Ford, walk, but they replace him with Frank Clark, with them having a plan with Patrick Mahomes. These guys aren't just making decisions, minute by minute. I think they truly, truly have a plan. So when they let both tackles, essentially, they moved on from both of them after the season, after what we saw in the Super Bowl, they clearly had a plan, and now we're seeing it. And so, look, I think it's kind of the brilliance of Kansas City with how they've continued to, build their roster even when they've had good players move on. And I really think it's a non-issue for the Ravens. And Max, I would just say to you, Chris Snee and Sean O'Hara and David Deal, those guys are not just walking through the door, man. Sorry about that.
But you know what? You're right. They're not walking through the door, Tim. That's exactly right. You got to go get them. I look at, you could talk about the importance of the offensive line. Who wants to bring it and actually walk the walk? The Cowboys, once upon a time, because their last dynasty was built on the best line in football. So they spent 4 out of their 5 first-round picks, 5 years, 4 times first-rounder went to the O-line. That's why Romo and then Dak were so well protected. That's why the offense worked so well, because they really brought it. They put their money where their mouth was. I hear the Giants talking a lot about that, different teams. I said, Stephen A., the Steelers got to do it. Look what Kansas City did. You basically let go of
On NFL Draft today, we focus on Stephen A.'s Steelers. Pittsburgh got off to an 11-0 start, but lost 4 of their last 5 before getting upset in the playoffs by who? Oh, yeah, the Cleveland Browns. Big Ben is back for what many believe will be his final season, but a big question mark, who lines up behind Ben after the exit of James Conner, who went to the Arizona Cardinals? Stephen A., would you like your Steelers to go running back? Oh, look who's here. Our quarterback, Tim Hasselbeck, back with us. Great to have you, Tim. I'm sorry I was so rude. Stephen A., back to you. Would you like your Steelers to go running back?
Desperately. They've had one of the worst running attacks in football the last 3 years. That's not something that's synonymous with the Pittsburgh Steelers. The reality of the situation is we judge Ben Roethlisberger, and obviously we were disappointed in how the season ended because they nosedived the last 5 or 6 weeks of the season, and we get all of that. But I remind everybody that Ben Roethlisberger was coming off of elbow surgery. Obviously, this was his first season back after elbow surgery took him out pretty much the entire previous season. And so for him to come back and have to throw the football so much, you had to do so because you didn't have a running attack to rely upon. They've got receivers. You see a Juju Smith-Schuster. You see a Chase Claypool. You see a James Washington and others. And you know what their passing game brings to the table. They've got enough weapons to throw the football too. But when you talk about ball control, when you talk about taking pressure off the quarterback and all of those things, you got to be able to run the football in order to pull those things off. And that's what the Pittsburgh Steelers have been devoid of. So I think they desperately need a running back. I'm a huge fan of Najee Harris out of Alabama. I think he's an absolute stud. I don't know if he'll be there at number 24, but if he is there at number 24, you desperately need to take him. You've got an elite defense. Offensively, you got a passing attack. I know you got to build your offensive line, and I get all of that. But at number 24, is there going to be a stout offensive lineman that's going to be that much of a difference maker? I don't know that. But I know Najee Harris can be a difference maker, and that's why you take the best player in that position.
Well, they definitely need help on their running game, no question. But Stephen A., what has that got to do with a running back? I mean, apologies to Bill Polian, who forgot more football than I'll ever know and once told me the back makes the line, but that's not what any of the evidence suggests. The evidence suggests quite the contrary. Casey Joyner, the football scientist, have him on the radio show, Max Kellerman Show, 2 p.m. Eastern on ESPN Radio and ESPN+. And he's brought up the fact that when you look at it, in fact, an average running back behind the top line is going to get 7-8 yards when he, a carry. An excellent running back behind a bad line is going to get 2 or 3 yards. The issue with the Steelers and their running game, Stephen A., no doubt the run game needs work, but early on, they were good because they were doing it with smoke and mirrors. And then eventually the league realized, it's smoke and mirrors. They really can't block for the run. And that went away. You can get a bunch of running backs every year to run behind a real good offensive line and get you good returns. The Steelers need to rebuild the line. Look at what Kansas City just did in this offseason. I'm a Giants fan, Stephen. I've been waiting 10 years for them to rebuild the line. Kansas City just did it in 1 year. Their line, at least on paper, looks devastating. The Steelers need offensive line help. Period. Forget the back. You can go find a back. Get the offensive line help.
I think there was a stretch when, Le'Veon Bell was a Steeler and he was running well, that the Steelers probably had the most underrated line in football at the time. They were really good. They were athletic. They were good pass blockers. Did an excellent job sustaining, which is why Le'Veon could run with patience the way that he ran. Look, I'm not a huge fan of drafting running backs in the first round, not because I don't think they can help. They certainly can. They can, in many cases, become nearly half of your offense. But I think that the talent disparity from a first round running back, to a second or third, or even some cases an undrafted running back are not nearly as significant as an offensive tackle that you could find in the first round versus one that you find in the 5th round or the 3rd round or something like that. And so for that reason, I think that going offensive line makes the most sense for Pittsburgh because they will be a back that probably won't be as good as Najee Harris, but maybe is not that far removed and behind a better offensive line can end up being a pretty good back, especially